So thank you very much for inviting me to come here, especially the Southeast Climate Center and Eric has done an amazing job of organizing my trip. And I had a great experience talking with everyone today, graduate students, professors, postdocs. And I also got in a trip to Duke, so I'm doing a little tour of the research triangle, but just two universities, so I really experienced the research line that was in Triangle. So in the spring, I was out on the Arctic Plain here. This is just north of the Brooks Range in Alaska, and so we have this remote camp set up, and we're trying to understand how fish are responding to climate change. And in a normal year, at this time of year, we'd be looking at a landscape that was covered in snow. The lakes would be iced over, the rivers still iced over. We'd have plenty of time to get prepared for our work. We came in, the plan was for me to come in late May. That got revised several times, lots of fees on the airlines. And I ended up coming in 2 weeks early, and it was already too late. And my research tech and student, they came in even earlier than that, a couple weeks earlier. They were supposed to take all our equipment into the camps with snow machines, and when they arrived, they saw this. So they weren't going to get the snow machines out to our remote sites. So we ended up having to get helicopters to get our equipment in. And it turns out that this was the warmest May on record on the North Slope. And so, everything you see today is really based on the experiences that I've had in my research career and seeing these changes firsthand and trying to understand and predict the effects into the future. And so, the things that we saw in the Alaska this spring is indicative of the average temperatures in the Arctic in the latter part of this century. So we're already seeing these effects happen and understanding that everything changes when you warm up the system. I had a chance to work with Bruce Peterson, who had worked in the system for 30 years. And the first time he brought up me as a young scientist, he just looked around and said, everything is different now since I was here. There are bushes here where there used to just be low grasses. The mountains used to be covered in snow all summer long. Now they're free of snow. And, I know it's just a number, but when we reached 400 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it just seemed like we had, sort of entered a new period. And it's sort of like when you're not yet 40, and you think that, 40 is just a number, but it is different maybe. And then 400 parts per million, is something different. And when I was a grad student, it was, 360. I thought it would take a long time, but things haven't declined at all. We're still releasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's going up unabated, and we're over this level. And 1.2 degrees Fahrenheit, that's the increase last year in temperature relative to the baseline. And there was a lot of talk about some sort of pause in the temperature record. In fact, I saw a comment by a representative from Alabama in my USA Today in my hotel room this morning, and it said, temperatures haven't risen in the last X years. But that's not true. We see this continual rise through some statistical artifacts in terms of there's some variance in those patterns, maybe some heat is being stored in the ocean, but the temperature continues to rise, and this year will almost certainly be the warmest year on record. And of course, you guys know that this is spawned in extreme events, such as rainfall here, but also in South Carolina. Scientists have come out and suggested that there's been contributions, especially from the incredibly warm waters in this region. They're the warmest they've ever been recorded right here where the hurricane passed through, which contributed to these meteorological events. And in February 1985, I'd like to use this statistic. So how many people in the room, if you can raise your hands, were born after this month? Okay. So Nick had to put his hand down. So everyone who had their hand raised has only lived life on a warmer planet. So since that period, there's never been a month that's been average or below average on the Earth. And so everyone has, since that period, has only known a warm Earth. And so about half the population has now grown up in the climate changed Earth. And so there's this issue of shift in baselines. So based on those changes in the climate and the need to predict those, we know that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change came up with these predictions, and those models have improved through the years to try to understand what the future climate will look like, and based on different scenarios of emissions. And for that, they won the Nobel Peace Prize. And so amazing work. And we know more than ever, there's still uncertainties, but we know more than ever what the climate will do under different scenarios. But what I've been interested in is how good are we doing as biologists? So how well are we doing at making these predictions into the future so that we can inform management actions and even inform what policymakers do in terms of emission scenarios? And I'd hold that we're not doing a very good job, that we still don't necessarily know which species are at risk. And the first step in this process is understanding where we are in the current state of information and where we need to go. And so that's what I'm going to focus on in my talk today. So I'll talk about the current state of information, the current predictions that we have. I'll quickly move into a critique of those models, and then talk about some ways in the future that we might be able to incorporate more mechanisms into our thinking, both based on some theory, combining species interactions, in this case competition and dispersal, and also some empirical work in my system in temperate ponds in New England, thinking about how sensitive top consumers might be and how that might affect ecosystems, climate change. So we'll start with the current predictions. And as I was getting interested in this topic, I look in the literature, and there's lots of different studies out there that suggest different extinction risks. So famous studies suggest 15 to 37%. Another study might say 11 to 17%, but more taxonomically limited. And then work on mountain species suggests it might be anywhere from 0 to 40%. So a wide range within studies, but also a wide range between studies. And so depending on which study you want to cite, you could come out with a really gloomy picture of extinction risk from climate change, or you might come out with a rosy picture. And so I thought, well, we could do better. We could actually take all that information and combine it in a quantitative way that uses the uncertainty of those predictions to estimate an overall percent extinction risk, but more importantly, also use all those studies to understand the assumptions that are important in these modeling procedures and understanding which regions are most at risk and which species. So this sort of became a strange hobby of mine, where for about 2 years, I'd wake up every morning and I'd think, okay, I'm going to look for some more extinction studies. It's not the most, the happiest start to your day. But in the end, I ended up finding 131 studies. So these were all multi-species studies. The reason being there are more single species studies, but often those species are targeted for a specific reason. So there's a little bit of bias there. We know the species is threatened, so we're going to study it. So I wanted to use these multi-species studies because there's the opportunity for species to do better under climate change or do worse. They made about 500,000 predictions. So I combined all those into a quantitative framework, used a Markov chain methods to get out an estimate, weighted those studies by the number of species that they looked at to get an extrapolation that's even across species, and did that for systems throughout the world. And so when you do that, you come out with a histogram of the number of studies according to different classifications of extinction risk. And so you can see right away that there are some studies that show no risk for that assemblage, and others as much as 50%. And if you determine that overall mean across those studies, you get to about 8%. If you assume about 8 million species, which we don't really know how many species are out there, but looking at about 600,000 species are at risk of extinction. And I use that term very specifically, at risk of extinction, not are extinct, because these are studies that suggest that sometime in the future they're at risk of extinction, but it doesn't mean that they're extinct yet. just means that the processes have been set in place, and given the different scenarios of climate change, that they would be at risk of extinction at some point in the future. We can ask, well, where in the world are these risks most prominent? And so I think that there's two things to take away from this. One is that there are certain regions of the world that appear, based on our current understanding, to have higher risks, most especially South America, where the risk is about 20%, and also Australia and New Zealand. So those are the two places that seem to be the hotspots of these climate change risks. I can't pull apart necessarily exactly why that is the case, but the indications, at least of the studies in South America, we're working with lots of endemic species with small ranges, often on mountainsides, that are leading to that higher extinction risk. In Australia and New Zealand, it seems to be a picture mostly of small land masses, that you have terrestrial species that are marching toward the ocean in terms of their climate envelope, and then once the climate envelope goes out over the ocean, then they have no more habitat left. The other point is that, well, one, North America and Europe seem to have lower risk, so still a substantial risk, about 5%, but lower than other parts of the world. And this is also where most of our effort has been. So about 60% of those studies are located in those regions. And so we're studying the places where it's still important to understand these risks, but we're also neglecting places where maybe the risks are higher. And another point is that many places in the world don't have a lot of work done on them. And so, for example, Asia had 4 studies in that complete data set. And I suspect that, especially Southeast Asia has high risk. It's just that there are no studies on it. So there's, we're probably getting a better handle on Europe and North America, but most places in the world, we don't really have a good handle on that extinction risk. So one of the biggest factors that differs among these models is the types of emission scenarios they use and the types of models for climate change. And so these studies spanning back to the 90s have used many different models. And I went back and found each model and was able to calculate for the period over which they made the predictions for extinction risk, what was the predicted change in global temperatures. And the reason being is I wanted to understand, well, given that there are decisions being made about emissions in the world, specifically the Paris COP21 meeting is going to meet, and people around the world, policymakers, are going to decide, where the target is for the Earth for temperature change. And so I wanted to give those policymakers a choice in terms of, what do their decisions mean in terms of potential biodiversity loss. And so when we do that, I put this all in the framework of the temperature rise since pre-industrial times. So currently, we're at about 0.85 degrees Celsius. And according to those predictions, so these are the credible intervals around the regression line, there's a significant curvilinear relationship. So this was a surprise to me. I expected there'd be a proportional increase in risk as you raise the Earth's temperature, but no matter how I looked at it, there was always this acceleration of risk. And so it seems to be that in multidimensional climate space, habitat area is declining as some sort of square or multiple of those changes in just temperature rise. So precipitation patterns are changing, all sorts of other climate variables, so that the habitat area is decreasing faster than just a proportional increase. And so where we are right now, the prediction is about 3% of species are at risk. That doesn't mean that they're extinct right now, but it means that they're potentially extinct in the future without conservation, or about 200,000 species. If we get to 2 degrees Celsius, so that's been sort of the long-held target around the world, although most people believe that the current trajectory and political inaction means that we'll probably exceed this at this point. So it doesn't seem that might work. Maybe we'll see something like that set at the Paris meeting, but people are not very optimistic about that. So that leaves about a 5% extinction risk. We can go to some of the emission scenarios. So a moderate one goes up to 8%. And then if we look at the business as usual emission scenario, we would go to about 16%. And this is lower than some of the individual studies suggest, but so people have said, well, we're surprised at such a low number. No, I mean, 16%, that's 1 in 6 species. Go outside and count 6 species on your hand and think that one of them might be at risk. It's pretty profound, and obviously we need to do something to limit that risk. As I said, it's not just enough to look at these numbers, but also to think about what's really important in predicting these extinction risks. And so one of the most important things would be dispersal. So as species are experiencing different climate and their suitable habitat is shifting, dispersal is really important for them to try to keep up with those changes in their habitat and move across the landscape. And so I'll show you a bunch of figures like this, where the bottom axis is percent extinction. This is the overall mean. That's that 8% from the original histogram. These are the different categories that I looked at and the number of studies that fit into them. The number of studies won't add up to 131 because some studies evaluate multiple assumptions. And then these are the mean and plus or minus the 95% credible intervals. So for dispersal, at least, most of the models will assume a universal dispersal. That means that the species can move wherever their suitable habitat goes, no matter how good or bad a disperser the species is. So you see that there's slightly less than 8%, like 5% if we assume that contiguous is they have to move through contiguous habitat landscape. Only a few of those studies. Many studies assume no dispersal, and so that's rather conservative, and that would increase the extinction risk up to about 4%. But I think what we really want is something like the species-specific results that fall in between those and are closer to that 8 or 9% range. And the reason why I think the species-specific results are probably the most applicable is because we don't just want to get an overall number, but we want to know which species are at risk. And as much as species differ in their dispersal abilities, we might be able to show that one species will do fine, will keep up with climate change, whereas another one will not. If we look at that with respect to temperature, we can see that matters quite a bit for those trajectories. So if a lot of species on the Earth are more in the low dispersal column, we can see that those extinction risks rise quite rapidly, up into 30 and 40%. So understanding the degree to which species can disperse fast enough to keep up with climate change is really important. And it's not just dispersal ability per se, it's also being able to disperse through the new habitat matrix, right? So it was one thing to go from here to Connecticut when there were no people around, but now try to do that, trying to get through DC as some sort of sensitive species. Hard for me to even get through DC in one car. And so I mentioned that this is all work that's looking at risk of extinction. So it doesn't mean that they're extinct now. And what I like to think about is in terms of an urn full of water. And we can think of the water symbolizing the numbers of individuals in that species. You put a hole in the bottom here, and so you set the processes in place for extinction to occur. But depending on the size of the hole, it might take a long time or a short time. And so this is critical because we can make these predictions that the species is committed to extinction, but we don't know when that will occur unless we can understand how fast that's happening and the so-called extinction debt, right? So there's this lag time between when you set the processes in place for extinction to occur and the extinction to actually happen. And so the models incorporate this in different ways. So they use different thresholds. Generally, most of the models are used in some sort of habitat. And so they estimate the current habitat, they estimate the amount of habitat in the future, and then they look at the increase or reduction of that habitat. And so depending on whether you use 100% threshold, meaning that all the habitat has to be gone for that species to go extinct. So that's ignoring any sort of fact that most times species will go extinct before all the habitat is gone. That's pretty conservative and leads to about a 5% extinction risk. Other studies use 95%. That means that 5% of the habitat is left when you consider that extinction will occur. Or many conservation groups are using an 80% threshold, meaning that 20% is left. And that would lead to much higher extinction risks. And the thing is, we really don't know, what that threshold should be. We probably can expect that it has something to do with the biology of the species. So some species maybe are okay and to the very last end of their habitat, but others will disappear long before all their habitat is gone. And so understanding those species-specific extinction depths will be really important. And this has one of the biggest effects on your predictions. Again, if you assume something like the 80% threshold, as a lot of conservation groups are assuming, then you get into really high numbers versus much lower numbers. It's more like 0%. So one of the things that I expected at the outset was that there'd be certain taxonomic groups that would be more at risk from climate change. And there's been multiple papers written about this. But when I look at these taxonomic groups in the model, there's no significant difference among them. So there's no taxonomic signal to those extinction risks. Now, if you look down the bottom here, you see amphibians and reptiles, which are usually the ones that are thought to be most at risk, and they do come out to be slightly higher risk, but it's not significant. And in part, it's because there's lots of variation within those groups. And afterwards, that makes sense, right? So one amphibian is not another. They differ quite substantially in their habitat areas and in their threats. But the other thing is that most of these models are blind to the traits of the species. So of course we don't expect to see a big difference among taxonomic groups if they're not accounting for, say, species-specific dispersal. So until we get to much better informed models, we're probably not going to see these differences come out. So that's the current state of information. And I think it's critical that we do that because we need to make decisions now. We're not going to be able to wait for better models to come online. But as much as I want to talk about the state of our current information, I really want to emphasize that it's not our best understanding. As biologists, we've worked for hundreds of years to understand the important processes that determine persistence of species in the landscape. And many of these aspects are not being incorporated into these models because most of them are these range models. And so basically you take the distribution of the species where it is today and you correlate that with some climate variables and then you project those into the future. And so it's all correlational. It's not incorporated in many of these important mechanisms. So for a long time, we're going to have to rely on these because we're not going to have the information or the models to do better. But we need to be working right now and trying to get those better models and trying to move beyond correlations and into a more process-based mechanistic framework. And so if you look across all those studies, you can see the strong increase in those studies of extinction risk from climate change through time. In red here, in this light green here, that's the only one. Those are the ones that are incorporating some sort of mechanism. It doesn't mean that they're mechanistic models per se. It just means that they're incorporating something about the biology of the species in this framework. And so most of those models are not incorporating that information. Some are incorporating dispersal. Some are around 14%. Some demography, about 12%. Fewer with physiology, about 6% with species interactions. And then you look at, in terms of adaptation across the range, how different populations might respond, or adaptive potential, and there's very few studies. So most of these studies are not incorporated in biology into predictions. And so when we are predicting the biotic response to climate change, we're mostly doing that without respect to species-specific dispersal, and I'll show you in a bit why that makes it really important. But just taken as a whole, so this is a number of different syntheses of dispersal among taxonomic groups. So these are log-oriented mean or median dispersal rates. And so for birds and mammals, you can see that they can disperse pretty well. So a kilometer, 10 kilometers, 100 kilometers. But for amphibians, we're talking more about 100 meters. Plants, something more like 10 meters. And then the poor ant-dispersed plants, relying on this ant to move the seeds, are moving just maybe sometimes centimeters. And so taxonomic groups obviously differ quite a bit in the dispersal, and yet we're not incorporating that into the models. And there's also quite a bit of variation within these taxonomic groups, as I mentioned. So if you build a small little pond in your backyard on a rainy night, the green frog is going to move a couple kilometers from a nearby pond and colonize your little garden pond. But yet, if you look at some of the terrestrial salamanders that we study, you walk out in your backyard and you lift up a log, and there's that salamander has offspring. You come back the next year and you see the offspring under the same log. Or maybe they move to the log over there, but they don't move very far. So even within the same taxonomic group, there's huge differences in dispersal capacity. That would be really important. We were also predicting these responses without species interactions. And as a community ecologist, this sort of gets to my heart, so we know that species interactions are really important, and yet they're not in these models. And if we look at a survey of those extinctions or population extirpations that have occurred already, at least in part due to climate change, this is a study by Kale in 2012, I indicated all those examples that in green that are through biotic interactions. It seems that often the extinction is not occurring directly because of warm temperatures or precipitation. It's occurring through species interactions. So there's indirect effects. And if that's the case, if that holds up, if more than 2/3 of those examples are really according to these indirect methods, then we definitely need to incorporate those into our understanding. And the other thing is we're not incorporating evolution into our thinking. And, a lot of this is doom and gloom, but, the bright spot is evolution. There's some species that may be able to adapt rapidly enough to be able to persist in the new climate, even to analog climates and new analog communities. There's only one study in those 131 that even tried to evaluate how evolution would affect the results. And in that respect, it was one of the 100 species and was based on a laboratory study of heritability in one case, one experiment. So really coarse, even that one study. So this is really the frontier in trying to understand how evolution affects these responses. So we did a study alongside a number of other authors, so a special issue in evolutionary applications, where we were looking at the degree to which traits might respond through evolution to climate variation. We only found one that was really through time, so we ended up having to look across space. And there's lots of evidence, about 60% of the traits we looked at had adapted across a species range in response to climate variation. So it does suggest there's adaptive potential out there, but it's unclear whether or not that adaptive potential is sufficient to allow for rapid adaptation to occur, at the same pace as climate change. But there is lots of adaptive potential out there to respond to climate. It's just a matter of whether we can understand whether that's fast enough. So where we find ourselves is sort of at the beginning of the climate change science, right? So early on, when there were some observations of carbon dioxide, there was some thoughts that this might alter the Earth's climate. People started to put together first correlative models, and then they started to add mechanism. They had a head start on us because they had already started to understand some of the physics of this. And so in 1981, James Hansen put together this sort of back-of-the-envelope model. It was one-dimensional. It really didn't account for many of the mechanisms we do today, but they started to incorporate mechanisms into these models to try to make predictions, even though they knew that the information was really uncertain. They didn't have a handle on many of the parameters. They started to make these predictions to understand the sensitivity of those results to that uncertainty. Since that time, there's been an explosion in the number of models. Started with 2, now we're at 45. The spatial resolution has decreased from 500 kilometers to 50 kilometers, and the precision has gotten much better. And so climate scientists coalesced around this idea that we need to build better mechanistic models, and we're going to train those on this network of weather stations around the world and try to do a good job of this. So it's really a scientific success story in many regards. For biologists, I think we're still back in 1981. I'm pretty sure I actually had that jacket. So, the next generation of these types of models are going to include our biological process-based mechanistic understanding. Some of the important parts to add right now are species-specific dispersal, biotic interactions, and evolution. So I want to talk a little bit more about biotic interactions and dispersal. And, you know, there was a bunch of us sitting around at the Nesson Center, actually, just a little ways away from here. And we were lamenting the fact that no one cared about community ecology and climate change research. And then we started to say, well, you know, what's really important is this interaction between biotic interactions and dispersal. And so what we were thinking was that, you know, there's in New England, you know, you get snow in the mountains, and everybody suddenly gets the idea they should go skiing, right? And so you could think about if there was a lane for everybody that goes up the mountain. And so you think about the mountain warming and species trying to track that warming up the mountain. Well, if each of those species is in a vehicle in its own separate lane, it can track that climate as fast or slow as it wants to, right? But as we know, there's not a million lanes going up the mountain to the ski area. There's often one. And so that leads to perhaps a stronger role for especially competition, because as one vehicle speeds up, it's going to run into another one. And you have this potential for these no island communities or loss of interactions. And so we built that into a model with 40 competitors up a climate gradient. It could be a mountain, it could be latitude. So this was a population-based model. We had the temperature warming. We had realistic temperature curves that are estimated from a synthesis of species. So they had a physiology that matches the sharp decline at high temperatures. We use those performance curves to determine the population rates of increase of those species at various temperatures. We warm up the gradient, and we see what happens. The competition between those is temperature-based, so a species who's in an area where it has more optimal temperature has a higher competitive rate against a species that has a lower temperature tolerance in that environment. And what we were interested in is what happens when you vary the mean dispersal in the entire community with respect to the variance among those species. We know that species are variable in their dispersal based on those other graphs. So what does variance among species matter in this type of situation? And so this is the results looking at just percent extinctions. So on the bottom here, you can see that this is an increase in mean dispersal of the entire community. And then moving up is the dispersal variation. So if you just look at this bottom line where there's no variation, basically you only see lots of extinctions when the entire community cannot keep up. When you get out in here, there's very few extinctions, really just the ones that go off the top of the mountain that become extinct. And so what you see is that basically as the gradient warms, those species just march up the mountain slope in sync. It's not really the way we think that the wheel works. But this is just showing you some model output from that. You can see those species marching across the gradient as it warms up. And at the end, you're just losing a few species off the top. Most of those species are doing just fine, marching along. You see lots of rare species doing well. So when we look at real variance among species and taxonomic groups in terms of dispersal, we actually are up here. So we're actually closer to 1. And so in that respect, if we have dispersal variation, this yellow one and blue one disperse faster than the middle one, what we see is that as that warms up, these move. These two compete with each other now. And so the middle one is not only now competing more with another species, but it's got low fitness because its climate has changed. And so those two effects together lead to a rapid loss of that species. And so high extinction risk with that variation. And so just to show you how that looks, here you see also a change in the rank abundance of species. So some are really high abundance and they decrease the extinction, and this red one was low and it starts to become more prevalent. And so you have this case where the best dispersers are the ones that are able to keep up with climate change, knock out their competitors in their way, and be able to survive. And so this competition leads to a much more reduced number of species that can survive under climate change. And we also see that competition really reduces the rate at which species can respond, because there's always a species in front. So we call it the boxcar effect, where you can only go as fast as the car in front of you. And we have species that go faster, and behind them you have this pile up on the climate change timeline. So we think incorporating an understanding of biotic interactions and dispersal variation together are really important. And just to show you that this effect is really important and based on competition, this is the original graph. Because it's a theory world, we can just turn off the competition among species and look at the same pattern. And you can see that it is this interaction between competition and interspecific dispersal variation, such that there are very few extinctions without the competition. So it's really the competition that's driving the importance of keeping up with climate change. All right, so I'm really a trophic ecologist, so I've been building these models of competition, and really want to work toward understanding more how food webs respond to climate warming. And my own system in temporary ponds suggests that there may be a greater importance of these top consumers in responding to climate change. And there's one of these cool scientific things where I was at this conference, and we had gotten these scientists from around the world to talk about how climate change is affecting species. And listening to all the talks, we very quickly realized that everyone was saying the same thing, that these top consumers, in their examples, seem to be much more sensitive to climate change and had a huge effect on the community and ecosystem. And so together we came up with this idea of the biotic multiplier effect. So stealing a term from economics, is that the biotic multiplier is a species that is both very sensitive to climate change and also has a large effect on the rest of the community or ecosystem. And so those two things together mean that, if you can understand the effect of that top consumer, you may be able to understand the effects that occur in the ecosystem. And of course, we'd like to understand the responses of all the species in the system, but at least as a triage approach, given that we often don't have that information, we might use this approach to identify some species that are biotic multipliers. And at least in the empirical examples we have today of really good long-term data and climate changes, it seems that top consumers are often the ones that are acting as biotic multipliers. So examples is the work on wolves declining with respect to the effect of disease and climate change and reducing for herbivores, reducing their diversity and affecting plants in the end. So whole scale changes in the ecosystem. So in my own system of temporary ponds, we want to look to see if this might be true in our system as well. And if you're looking for a sensitive species in this system, in New England especially, is the foremost changes we're seeing in New England are really based on winter temperatures. And so to understand what happens in the summer and spring, we really need to understand what happens in the winter. And so if you look at the warming in Connecticut and much of New England, you see that the winter temperatures are the most extreme. So we've had a change of 2 degrees Celsius in winter temperatures versus not as much change in other seasons. And so really we expect to see the biggest changes in those species sensitive to winter temperatures. And so we went to look for these biotic multipliers, both the sensitivity to winter temperatures and also play keystone roles in the system. And so that we are able to predict community and ecosystem impacts as much as we can based on this more limited approach. And so, we used to never go out in winter. We were temporary pond folks, so we would go out, when the ice came off in the spring and study them until they went dry in the summer. But we find that a lot of the dynamics in the spring are determined under the ice cover. So now we go out and we auger the ice and look down, and we find this whole community. So there's zooplankton swimming around, and there are these marbled salamander larvae that are swimming around eating the zooplankton even at temperatures of like 0.3 degrees Celsius. So there's this whole system going on in the winter. And it used to be that these ponds would get so cold and there'd be no open leads and these are pretty high nutrient systems so that the oxygen was robbed very quickly from the water, and it would eliminate these top predators from the ponds. But as the winters have warmed in Connecticut, you see that that's not the case anymore. And so this is the marble salamander larva. It's the top predator in these temporary ponds. It's like the lake trout in a lake, but in a small temporary pond, even though they're these little guys, they act as the same role. And we have lots more temporary ponds to work with in a small landscape to understand these processes. And so we've been tracking the proportion of ponds in our study site, a long-term study site, that have this top predator, the marble salamander, through time. And when I first started working here as a grad student, we were at about 50%, up to about 60%. And, one of my undergraduate advisors at Muhlenberg told me before I left, she said, as soon as you start working in a system, start taking long-term data, like immediately, and continue that data for the rest of your life. And I always think back to that because it was really important that I did this, because I then went on a postdoc out to sunny California, and I came back, and this is what I found. So the whole system had shifted. So now we're in a system where almost every pond has the predator. And there have already been sort of indications of warmer winters here that are starting to increase them. And a number of warm winters in the meantime, while I was away, led to this complete shift of the system to basically completely dominated by this top predator. So the lesson was never go away for a postdoc. And that probably warm winters were having a big effect on the system. And we can look at January mean temperatures or other assays to show that yes, the proportion of marble salamanders is correlated at least with these warmer winters. The other thing that's happening is that warmer temperatures in the spring are leading to larger marble salamander larvae. So the top predators actually grow in faster. And so when the spotted salamanders arrive, the marble salamanders are much bigger. And that matters quite a bit for their dynamics because the top predator is gate limited. It can't eat larger spotted salamander larvae. Show you what that looks like here. So this on the left is the top predator, the marble salamander. This is the spotted salamander. And they just suck their prey in. And as soon as those prey head sizes get to be about larger than 40% of the width of the mouth, this predator is no longer effective. And so these guys want to grow to a size that's big enough to avoid predation. But it's harder and harder to do that as these things grow faster. And so we know based on the food web that the spotted salamander larvae, the Bisma maculatum, and the marbled Bisma opacum are sharing invertebrate predators and zooplankton, and that could have an effect on algae in the system. And so we've done mesocosm experiments to show that effect of the introduction of that top predator to new sites in terms of decrease in zooplankton biomass to about a quarter. So they're really effective predators on that shared resource. That has an effect, a top-down effect of permeating through the food web to increase algal abundance, and also has an effect of decreasing zooplankton diversity. So we know at least in experiments that this predator can have a large effect on the entire system. And now we're actually doing whole pond manipulations to understand this in the field. So we're starting to fence ponds, and we're removing them from ponds that have them, or we're adding them to ponds that don't, to really understand these effects in the field. And we're getting new insights from that. And so this is a low predation pond, which didn't used to have marble salamanders. And so we're increasing their densities to natural densities on one side, leaving them, removing them from the other side. And so in the normal low predation pond without the predators, you see that there's an equal proportion of herbivores and detritivores. So that's the system without the predator. Within one season of adding the marble salamanders, we see that the proportion of herbivores decreases quite a bit. And so you see a shift toward a detritivore or a brown energy pathway in that system. And it turns out that the marble salamanders really like to eat the herbivores. So they love wood frogs, they love zooplankton. And so they're targeting these things, whereas the detritivores are generally in the leaf litter, harder to attack. And we go to the high predation ponds and we remove the predator from one side. This is sort of the normal state of the predator ponds with very low herbivore density. And by removing them, we can't shift the pond back, at least in the short term. So it may, as we think about the future, as the predator would start to decrease, as temperatures go back to normal, it may take a longer period of time. So we're running these as long as we can to see how long that will take. And, when you're doing these experiments, you can look at statistics and graphs, but really a picture says 1,000 words. So this is a pond that before the introduction, before the marble salamander moved into it, it's nice and clear. And then we come back and we look, and these ponds are just filled with algae. So really dramatic changes in the system. We can spot a marble salamander pond now from, I don't know, about 150 meters, because we can just look in and say, oh, marble's in there because of the growth of algae. So from what we've understood now in the system is that with this climate fueled expansion of a top predator, we're going to see less zooplankton in ponds in New England, less prey diversity, fewer herbivores in the system, and a lot more algae. And this phenomenon of winter kill, keeping out top predators in shallow systems is pretty general. So we think that these results might apply throughout the temperate world, where winter kill is decreasing, and we're seeing a shift toward these ecosystems from temporary ponds up to shallow ponds, larger ponds, but fish now being able to survive in those ponds. Okay, so just to conclude, I think that the 90s and the 2000s, we saw the international community of climate scientists come together and coordinate their efforts to predict climate change in the future. So my hope is that the 2010s now, we're going to understand those climate change effects, and specifically on biotic responses. So can we shift toward understanding those extinction risks more fully and better inform models? So to move toward that, we need to develop the theoretical models that can incorporate these mechanisms. So we're working with some local demographic models that we've developed for our system with our predator-prey interactions. Also working with a group of people who are developing more complicated, sophisticated landscape models. One is lane shifter, where you can incorporate evolution and species interactions and dispersal, and try to put that in and try to understand how those effects might work across a little more landscape scale. But we need to come together and create these flexible platforms that people can use and put their mechanistic information into to make progress. So it's all well and good, and we're making progress on that front. It's not easy, the modeling front, but perhaps the more difficult part is that when we look across species, most species, we don't have those parameters to put in the model. We develop these fancy models, and we go out, and we find that, so here the quality of information in different categories of mechanism are coded from green to high to orange to low. And we're probably okay for European beach or Pacific salmon, or economic species, so we've got millions of dollars going into understanding those. But even the best ecological systems like fence lizards and speckled wood butterflies, there's major gaps, especially in food web effect and evolution. So this really means that if we're going to move toward these mechanistic models and incorporate biological realism, we need to go out and measure these parameters. So we need to get back to boots, binoculars, and beakers and measure these key parameters such as dispersal and food web effects and evolutionary potential in order to inform these next generation models. It's really a call for natural history, but in specific areas where we need those to make those predictions better. And so I hope I've convinced you that we have this rise in risk of extinctions dependent upon where we let the Earth warm. Our hope is that policymakers will understand that, understand the risks both direct from climate change, but also indirectly through losses of species. And I hope that we'll be able to come together and start to understand which species are most at risk so we can target those conservation dollars to those places. Is it the polar bear or is it the American pika? Where are we going to put our efforts? Which ones are most at risk, or which ones will be able to persist without radical efforts? And in the end, it really comes down to not just protecting our economies, but also just this intrinsic value of biodiversity. And, I couldn't imagine going into the world and not being able to expose my son to his first wood frog, I think that we all cherish this biodiversity, regardless of its economic value. And I think it's important we try to protect it. So some funding sources, but I'd like to thank you again for coming, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Mm. Yeah. 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 So one point I want to make is that I'm not sure it's biased high. I'm not sure where it's biased or if it's biased at all at this point, because for every mechanism I can think to add that might increase the extinction risk, there's another mechanism that might decrease it. So we really don't know yet the degree to which those species distribution models are biased high or low. In terms of explaining it to policymakers, I think the only thing that we can do is to provide scenarios like it did in terms of different amounts of warming to suggest the uncertainty around this, and that it's very high, and that this is the best information we have at this point. And hopefully convince them that we need to shift directions radically toward developing mechanistic models and collecting these parameters to be able to reduce that uncertainty. So I totally agree in terms of this isn't the best information we're going to have, but it's what we have right now. So we just have to be really clear about that uncertainty. Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah. So I did some analyses on the rapidity of the climate change that was evaluated in these models, and you can see an effect of that as well. So although many of these models can't really deal with that because they're actually not modeling processes through time. So in some ways, time is almost the important function in most of the models is just the overall change. But as soon as you do a model through time, then the rapidity becomes really important, as well as the variation through time. Yeah. 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 So I mean, one thing we need to understand is adaptation across a range, because as soon as you have that, it can really alter, how those dynamics play out. So the degree to which different populations will track that climate change can matter. And then you need to understand the adaptive potential and traits that are important in a species response. So one can think about physiological traits. So how much potential is there for a species to be able to adapt to warmer temperatures? And so it becomes really important at the lag and edge of the range, because there's where you're going to see the disappearance of species as things get really warm, for example. But if there's adaptive potential to deal with those warmer temperatures, then you may see those be able to persist. And so, it really takes, measuring adaptive potential through careful breeding designs or tracking individuals and families through time to be able to get those estimates of genetic variation. I think the tough part is figuring out what traits are most important, right? So you kind of measure traits and you got to decide which ones you're going to measure. But there are cases where we know, for example, desiccation resistance is important in fruit flies in Australia, and we can measure that variation, understand the degrees to which it will or will not allow them to survive with increase in droughts. A lot of it's going to be working on your system and understand what might be the most important selective factor. And mm-hmm. Right. It's always quarters with you. I knew you were going to work quarters in this summer. Yeah, right. So, for example, if you move those species or allow them to move through quarters, you may create some sort of interaction between species that then limits their ability. I think that understanding that interaction between the species interactions and dispersal rates would be important. So, we have some sense for sort of cartoons for how different community modules might interact with dispersal. So you have the quarter, and so does it matter if the predator moves faster than the prey through the quarter, and then the prey tries to move up there? What might happen? What happens if the prey moves faster? What happens if it's a mutualism and you break it apart? We can think about what happens. So I don't think we've gotten much farther beyond those cartoons of community modules and thinking about that. So, for example, the community stuff in dispersal is sort of the first lowest hanging fruit, and we've got some trophic models of now we've got herbivores and predators and plants, and it's it's complicated. It's even more interesting, and we get these effects where the predators move faster because we can think of a large predator and the herbivores, and they're able to maintain their fitness, and then the herbivores try to keep up a little bit slower, and they get completely consumed by the predators because they're now the prey are maladapted, they're not able to defend themselves easier, and then the whole system collapses, right? So the herbivores disappear, and the predators disappear. So I think our first attempt is to probably do some modeling of these cases, so just basic cases, and maybe the quarter experiment could try to address these things as you think about, or maybe larger quarters or something like that to understand how these interactions play out. Yeah, great question.
Yeah, I think we'll wrap it up. Let's say again.